It's like the students here are just not into. We had a discussion the other day, like in the faculty meeting, about whether we should even have a lecture stream.
Yeah. I hesitated about streaming it online for that reason, because that's usually like a double-edged razor.
Yeah, right.
Streaming online, and then some students who may be coming decide not to follow it online, but then in the end, it's actually better internationally because if you stream it online, people. So, yeah, but it's.
So I think in your case, it makes sense to stream it. Otherwise, when we stream it, it's true that we have less people. The students from Segovia are too lazy to.
I announced it in Segovia just in case. And guys, I'm giving a talk and it's on patterns. It's a little bit on patterns, so I think it's interesting for you. But yeah.
Which year was that? Like
yeah, they're working with that mess.
Yeah.
Interesting. Apparently, it's a collaboration like across.
Right. Yeah. It's like a. I think it's an ongoing thing. Like there's a contract for kind of a long-term collaboration.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think it's going to be primarily with a fashion degree because we have a new fashion program.
Right. That makes sense. It's David kind of blocking the relationships between the programs.
Yeah. They're trying to do now the same thing with Ferrari. We got like a kind of collaboration again in the design program with Ferrari.
Okay, so high end.
Yeah.
Only high end.
Yeah, it's only high end. Like the brand of the university, right?
Actually, yeah.
We don't take into the people like we.
No, only like Thank you so much for taking the time to go through the short book. It could be longer.
Yeah, it was very qualitative.
I mean, it could have been longer, but I think it's enough.
It's enough.
How long is it?
And 70, almost
That's a good size.
with plenty of notes.
The video is not going to be here by 2 weeks.
Oh, that's too bad.
That's why I mentioned it to you.
Right,
that it may be a little tight, and the paper issue is going to be about 2 weeks late. Unfortunately, so.
It's good to hear, like, I think.
It's okay. It's and it's basically like almost like catalog format, so it's size. But I said, let's go with it.
It says 45 euros. So it's good to be like a.
45 euros, yeah. In case you want to use it for something. That's it.
Yes, I think we might have more people online than people here. Not sure. Yeah.
They need to have comments.
Right. We communicated about this a while ago, but I think that we didn't do anything about it. There's an email about it a while ago. I can head down there and try to meet them.
Maybe.
Do you have their phone number?
I do, yeah. Well, I have both of them.
Okay.
I mean, they could just reach out to me, I guess.
Yeah.
They have my phone.
I mean, you can tell them that they should send you a WhatsApp when they arrive, and then and then we go down there.
I give them their names.
Okay, great.
So
Great.
they will call me
Great.
whenever they are there.
Excellent. So we should be all set.
Yeah, then it's okay.
Which should work, I guess.
Yeah, we had the lecture last week where the visitors they came in through the other lobby because there's a lobby in -4. Then there was this thing
There's
that
a little confusion.
Yes.
So Maria went downstairs to meet the guests, but they were coming in from the other lobbies. Yeah.
Semester in Segovia, it was this new professor, Suhan, and she was not registering the system, and the security guy was saying, yeah, but you cannot get in. You're starting in 15 minutes of first class, she's a professor, believe us. I mean, you need to get in. Like, no, because.
Is it like a new student instructor? It's a new student instructor?
Yes. Came before for some open
I think we had some students that did an internship there.
Así que son reviews.
Así que,
Qué bueno. Sí, está bien, ya
ya
hablaremos.
te tengo ahí.
Te mando mi.
So you're teaching option studios at Yale this year?
That's right, yeah. This is the second time I do it, but now I do it only once every other year.
Yeah.
Because I used to do it for 7 years, I did it almost once a year.
Yeah.
And then that was good for a better time, but then I was.
Pero tengo otro que son las robas en español.
Para tener dos perfiles.
It was like basically
Yeah.
Sí, sí, sí.
your time, but then after that, I've done it. On
Claro.
something else. And
So when you're there, you stay in New Haven, or you go back and forth? You have to New York.
And you have to go in twice a week. So 2 hours.
¿Sabes? Me da muy bien.
Bien,
Just I'm
genial.
train that one train is okay, miraculous.
Yeah,
12 hours door to door.
20 horas,
That's right.
There's New Jersey Transit.
More than 2 hours.
It's terrible, and it's short, they actually do it for example, it's very bad. But Metro North is only almost like European style.
I mean, there's an Amtrak. That's the Amtrak.
There's also another, like Amtrak is like 10 times.
Si no, ya.
It's only 15 minutes less.
Tres webs, tres Instagrams, los sigo teniendo, pero.
Someone that
No puedo más
working
me da la vida.
I mean, he knew you from Yale. I don't know if he was a teacher here. He was replacing Clara.
Yes, and
That the-
science history. Yeah.
Yes, exactly, yeah. Gabriel.
Yeah, back in a
It was from the exam. He knew you, but
Ah.
In a-
yeah, Gabriel.
It was
Yeah.
a visiting,
Yeah.
yeah, I met him.
Where do you want to
Yeah,
say?
yeah. He's still there, or?
No, he's here now.
Yeah, that's all.
Yeah.
Yeah, he told me, we should meet again, blah, blah, we should come down here, but then again.
I invited him to come today, but he teaches. He was busy. So. Yeah.
Oh.
I told him, bring your students from exam. He was like, "What?" He was like, "Yeah, I don't know if I could." But it's someone.
Somebody like that, it's all different.
No.
Spanish, something we should enjoy, and that kind of character, that environment. He was there for about 1 year.
I think so, yeah, he was in years. It's so bright. He was doing Fulbright. We met. Yeah, and I was on during the conference, and he was teaching at Ireland. And then he was like supporting me. And then since I joined, we are in the. I just joined like. Yeah. You know, can you imagine? It's amazing.
Basically,
Right,
all the
it's
places.
like an island. Yeah.
No.
She's British. Not always is unique in a good sense.
This is not being a record. This is not being a record, so we
No,
can say.
And in Spanish, something.
Oh, yeah. So we can talk.
Nothing very specific. I mean, maybe the period.
Great, so let's start. Hi, good evening, my name is Matan Meyer. I'm an associate professor here at High School of Architecture and Design, and together with Graziele Bruscato. I got her last name wrong last time, so it's okay today. So together we're curating the lecture series this year, and the topic of the lecture series is process, experimental practices for creative industries. Long name to basically signify that we're trying this year to look at processes and at practitioners and theoreticians that look at the process itself rather than the end result. So that's kind of a long, kind of a broad definition, but I think that Jose falls into that definition well. And I think that that the book that we're going to discuss today is right on the mark in terms of that. So I'll do a brief introduction to the respondents that we're going to have later. So José Aragüez is an architect, writer, and educator holding a PhD from Princeton University. He teaches at Yale University and runs José Aragüez Architects, a Paris-based office that maintains connections with New York and Malaga. He's the author of The Building, published by Lars Muller in 2016, and Spatial Infrastructure, published by Actar in 2022. His writings have also appeared in Domus, EFAX, Flat Out, The Rootlet Companion to Criticality in Art, Architecture, and Design, published by Routledge in 2018, Radical Pedagogies from MIT Press, and Technoscape, The Architecture of Engineers, among other media. So Jose is going to share with us a newly published book titled, as you can see there, Dispositional Intelligence. After the talk, we have three distinguished respondents here. We have Clara Murado, Principal Clara Murado and Elvira Architect, based in Madrid, and a professor at the University of Alcalá de Henares. Then we have Ignacio Senra, Principal at bojaus Architecture, and a professor at the Politecnica de Madrid. And our own José Vela, professor here, Professor of Architecture here at the High School of Architecture and Design. So José, thank you for joining us. Go ahead. We're trying to
It's here.
Same with the other screen.
Maximize.
Screen in front of you.
if you just do Control L.
No, Matan is because it's okay.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, well, thank you, Matan.
Just a sec, Carolina, do you know if the screen, is shared on Zoom?
No.
It doesn't look like, so
Doesn't look like.
let's share the screen. Yes, we can just share the whole screen. Okay. I guess we can't see the other people online, but maybe that's okay.
I mean, as long as we know they are seeing
Yeah.
the screen.
Yeah, someone just send a message.
Yeah, somebody's in the chat message, maybe they're saying something.
Thank you.
Enrique. And how do we?
Participants?
Yeah.
You too.
Okay.
No, I didn't, but.
I think maybe it's in more.
If you
It's shared already, but we think we need to do it to choose full screen somewhere, and then we'll see the.
Does anyone knows how to? If you hover over the app of Zoom, I think you'll see. Yeah, this one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know.
Let's remove the screen.
Where my knowledge goes. Yeah, just click on share there.
Yeah, it's already shared.
There.
Oh, there we go. We do here. If we do here, full screen.
Okay. More people can use it. It's free.
I think now it's all good.
Okay, now we're good.
Yeah, I think we're good.
Well, thank you, Matan, Graciele, and Carolina for graciously hosting me today and organizing everything so efficiently and so smoothly. It's great to be back, i.e. to talk about my next publication, which should be here today, but it's not by just about a couple of weeks because of a paper availability issue, but let's say the talk was in anticipation of that new book. So I have, let's see if this was on. No. No, it's only with the remote.
No, actually, I think if you move
The cursor need to be back
Yeah,
to the
exactly.
screen.
You can touch the screen.
Yeah, no.
No.
You can also control it with the remote.
I guess I've spent the last decade probing the question of architectural thinking as a form of knowledge. And the book, Dispositional Intelligence in Architecture, comes to close out that trilogy. And I mean, I guess architectural thinking is a phrase that we tend to use often in Romance languages, maybe not so often in English. But I guess what I mean by that is just a discursive domain articulated around the building and the design processes leading up to the building, which is simultaneously distinct and also connected to the rest of disciplines in the humanities and the social sciences. So we think that domain, essentially this new publication, Dispositional Intelligence, is just an attempt to deconstruct the notion of form. Form is a concept in architecture that I think tends to appear in many guises. If we look at the 20th century and also into the 21st century, so the understanding of form in nature, form as the reification of power structures, the psychology of formal perception, form as a catalyst of participatory processes. There's a number of ways in which form tends to appear, but I think it's a little bit more rare maybe that it is taken as a domain of research in its own right within architecture. So this project is about that. And the first clarification is to say that the grounds for the project are articulated around something like what's below, so something like spatial organization and terms like disposition, arrangement, organization, which would correspond, in my understanding, to a term form, and not so much about things like figure, outline, or exterior volumetric condition, which would correspond to shape. Now, that disposition, arrangement, organization would, I guess, generate a potential for that which is organized to house a set of human activities, right? What we tend to call program. So I guess the first idea is to say that form is posited here as three-dimensional organization inflected with a programmatic potential. This is something I'm going to be saying in different ways, I guess, over the course of the talk. So the platform from which to attempt to craft this formal domain is a historically situated discussion of three figures who operated on the margins of architecture. Italian artist, architect, and educator Vittorio Giorgini. Ukraine-born Israeli engineer and geometer Michal Burt. And engineer, designer, theorist Cecil Balmont, born in Sri Lanka and operating between Colombo in Sri Lanka and London in the UK. So that is to say that basically the purview and scale of their work falls within architecture, but at the same time, it was strongly driven by a series of scientific modalities, some of which I'm going to be touching on briefly today. In other words, you could say that the state, I mean, part of the argument here is that the state is of a particular kind of production on the edge of architecture simultaneously inside and outside, enables such production to offer a frame for a new conceptualization of form in architecture. And we could call that subversive disciplinarity. Yeah. So, Giorgini was essentially a pioneer in instrumentalizing surface topology for the purpose of architectural design with a marked level of scientific self-consciousness. Now, Bert's body of work represents one of the earliest, most thoroughgoing investigations into three-dimensional models for the subdivision of space based on patterns of configurational continuity. And Cecil Balmont was a trailblazer in theorizing the question of nonlinearity at the core of the so-called digital turn. So these are some of the reasons why these figures were chosen, in addition to the fact that the bodies of work present three levels of idiosyncrasy with respect to the tradition of the architecture engineering hybrid where they belong. I'm going to pause here for a second and say that I want to keep the talk short enough. So some of the terms I'm mentioning here, I'm actually not going to explain. So maybe some of that's going to sound a little bit cryptic, but hopefully during the discussion, the respondents will bring up some of those questions, and otherwise I can also explain. But I prefer to kind of give you an overview and a vocabulary, even if some of the things are not going to be clear enough. So another level of idiosyncrasy with respect to the context in which the design thinking originated and that enabled its appearance. And also with respect to what I call the post-war shift toward deep scientization of design, which I'm going to say almost nothing about in the talk, but it's something that's elaborated on in the book in depth. So I guess that's the primary historical argument in the book, that the architectural thinking embedded in the idiosyncratic character of the work of Giorgini, Bert, and Balmont gives rise to a domain of design that constitutes a particularly appropriate medium to craft a new conceptualization of form in architecture. Right? Since I know there are students in the audience, I think one of the difficulties for some courses, like thesis, for example, or some history theory courses, is to come up with a thesis. What's your thesis? What's the thesis of your project? This would be the thesis, the historical thesis of the book, right? Now, it is up to the reader to decide whether it's accurate, whether it is substantiated enough, whether the book actually provides enough evidence. But the form of this statement would be that of something like a thesis. Maybe useful to point it out. So I'm going to try to write about form and particularly about the concept of form. In order to do that, you're trying to tap into a traditional theory, basically, something about concept. You kind of need to go over prior theories of architecture and prior theories of form to see what other people have said before you, right? And see whether there's any niche of opportunity to contribute something different, something new, right? So that's part of what I do in the book as well, to critique, to analyze prior theories of form and prior theories of architecture, and suggest form themes that would require particular attention and that would require to reflect on and somehow structure the book in general. That would be the relationship between generic forms, specific form on the one hand, and form and shape on the other hand. Something that's just calling stylistic non-referentiality with respect to style. The relationship between form and formation. So not only talk about, Matan introduced the lecture in the frame of process, right? So it's not just about outcome, it's about the relationship between form and between outcome and process. And see it as a way to transcend the duality of form versus program, which continues to structure most of our work in architecture today. So when it comes to Giorgini, firstly, I look at his work involving shell structures and surface topology that he developed primarily within 20 years, between the late 50s and the late 70s, half in Florence in Italy and half in New York, primarily at the Pratt Institute. And the argument of this particular section is to say that the very particular, very idiosyncratic character of his work can only have come as a result of a combination of a sort of anti-rationalist environment that existed in Italy in the post-war years. So going against what came out of the modern movement and how that was associated to things involved in the war, and the opposite, and the rationalist basis that his work acquired when he moved to the US, right? So a combination of anti-rationalism and rationalism generated the idiosyncratic character of his work, right? That's the thesis of this particular segment of the book. So I'm going to be focusing the book does a certain job of historicizing all of that, but for the purposes of the talk, I'm not gonna address that. So I'm gonna focus on rather the aspects involving design criticism and a little bit of form analysis as well, not the historical aspects, although it's almost like half the book, basically. So initially, Giorgini was kind of looking at nature and see whether through that he could achieve a sort of liberated kind of design thinking away from the formal rejections that he felt were coming out of the modern movement. But at the beginning in the 60s, it was out of intuition and kind of being inspired by the imagery of nature. Right? But then he moved to New York in '69, and his whole work started to take on this more scientific bent in such a way that it became really a research project concerning the study of systems of double curved structures, foreshadowing the construction of something like a geometric theory of design. So the main component of this theory, one of the main components of this theory, is a series of topological transformation. I'm going to say maybe a few words about topology later on for those of you who may not be familiar with that. A series of topological transformations, some of which you see up on screen, chiefly based on rotation, bending forces, and on triangular symmetry, which ended up constituting his design vocabulary, right? So in topology, I don't know to what extent you're familiar with it. I mean, to put it simply, it's basically segment a portion of geometry dealing with transformations that can be applied to certain forms and certain figures that carry one form into the other, while observing a certain number of what's called topological invariants, right? So that sounds, again, a bit cryptic, but basically, if you take a cube and sphere, there is a continuous transformation that brings the cube into the sphere, while these so-called topological invariants, which I'm going to say a word in a minute, are observed, meaning you don't punch through a surface, you don't glue any surface to any other surface, right? There's certain things you cannot do. You can stretch, you can bend, you can crumple, but you cannot tear or glue, right? Certain things you can do, certain things you can't do. So if you have a torus, for example, the torus cannot be brought into a sphere because there's a hole in between, right? So that would be a different category. So this, Giorgini was using the knowledge that he acquired about topology to apply that, not to just a cube and a sphere, but actually to generate something like a lot more personal, a lot more, like I continue to use this word, idiosyncratic, more particular, until he arrived at something like that, whose project manifestation you're going to see in a minute as well. So this, what you're seeing on the right here, plan and section of his main build project, Saldarini House from 6062 in Tuscany. You know, the thing to understand here is that he did have a certain fixation with curves, right? Even though designers versed in topology know that you need to resort to curves necessarily because the curved or a straight nature of an edge or a line are completely inconsequential in topological terms. Meaning, if you have a straight line and you have a curved line next to it, topologically speaking, they are the same thing, right? If they have no nodes in between, you have nodes in between, that's a different story. But if no nodes are on the line, they are the same thing. What does that mean? That you can literally imagine that house designed and built with straight edges and 90-degree angles, and it would be topologically equivalent to what you're seeing up on the screen. And since he knew that, because he did acquire the necessary knowledge of topology to be able to maneuver, to manipulate those kinds of operations, that means that on some level, he actually was aesthetically drawn to the curve, right? That's also important to point out. I mean, I don't want to like go on a tangent because then the talk is going to be too long, but it's important to point out because there's a certain tradition of speaking about topology in architecture that associates that word with curves, while topology has nothing to do with curves, right? Okay, so many of Giorgini's sketches, for example, this one, illustrates, I think, appropriately the difference between shape and form that I put up at the beginning of the talk, right? So if you look at this guy here, that one there, you see like there's a curved surface that generates 3 regions of space around it, right? So 1 underneath the curve here, and then 2 above the convex, each one of the convex sides, right? And it's curved. But if you take this guy here, see, it turns out space is arranged in the similar way. So the same 3 regions are generated around the surface, and yet this one features only straight edges, right? So that means that these 2 would be the same form, but the shape of this one is different from the shape of that, right? So there are many sketches like that in Georgina where you can see that differentiation between the 2 concepts. To put it differently, this is an unbuilt project that he did. It was from the early 60s. Qualities concerning shape are rendered irrelevant by topology. Shape doesn't matter, really, right? Now, another important aspect is that the idea of program, meaning the activities that are housed in a building, are incorporated into all of these topological transformations. Right? What that means is that every iteration in the process of design features certain relational properties such that they are readily available to housing a series of human activities, right? And as a matter of fact, if you look close enough, you can see it up on the screen, but that sketch up on the top is actually annotated. So it says kitchen, living, bathroom, laboratory, and so on. That seems kind of maybe obvious, right? And it's self-evident, but it's not, because there is a whole trajectory of design thinking, not that old, but actually more recent, where these topological transformations will not necessarily take program into account in any realistic sense. Right? And so part of what's happening, very important thing about these 3 bodies of work is that no matter how crazy the work or how idiosyncratic, the idea of a program is somewhere there. Not always, but in many cases. I'm going to try to be specific about that as I'm along with the talk. So there are 2 other concepts he introduced in his theory to further ground the idea of program inhering in form, and those are zones of influence and transitional elements, which I go at some length in the book to kind of describe in relation to these drawings. I'm not going to do it in the talk, but just going to throw those terms out there. And I myself contribute the idea of latent arrangement to suggest that a certain form can have a series of compartmentalizations that are latent, even though it may only be one that's materialized at any point in time. And that has something to do with the way you design these complex organizations. So basically, just summarizing, Georgina's body of work happens to be useful for introducing how topological analysis can be instrumentalized to determine formal qualities, that is to say, to determine how a specific material articulation organizes space differently in essence, as opposed to embodying a distinct shape. Moving on to, this is Bert's, the beginning of Bert's work. I look at what he did in terms of complex systems of space subdivision and spatial articulation based on periodic geometry and their occasional rapport with questions of structural performance, right? So what's called theoretical morphology and structural morphology. Theoretical morphology is about trying to invent new ways of articulating space, as many as possible, as long as they rest on mathematical equations. And structural morphology would be about studying, analyzing the static properties of these new configurations that are invented. So he did more of the former than the latter, but he still did a little bit of that correspondence every now and then. He primarily dealt with something called sponge polyhedra, which is basically an extension of the idea of a polyhedron being an icosahedron or a tetrahedron, or right, so a closed off set of polygons where all of the edges happen to be common to at least two faces, right? So there is a way in which certain mathematical formulas that describe a polyhedron, right? And you can still meet those formulas and yet imagine that those polyhedra can be actually open as opposed to closed and extend infinitely in space, right? And so a segment of that is called sponge polyhedra, and that's one of the things he did. And then he also devoted a lot of attention to something called sponge surface, which is something different, meaning double curved surfaces that extend infinitely in space. And you see a fair amount of those in the slides. Here, the main sort of argument for this part of the book is to say that though embarking in a direction completely dismissive of any architectural consideration or consideration condition in terms of discourse, he ended up carrying the central elements of morphology's critique of modernism in terms of a functionalism, in terms of the condition of building as objects, and in terms of the modernist language to an extreme, even though he wasn't aware of that. So in other words, he did that unwittingly. He opposed the condition of the building as object, think like Corbusier, Mies, to infinity, where the object is lost, but what you have is a field instead. He came up with a series of linguistic expressions for architecture that have nothing to do with the modernist language. And he did all of that out of a radical autonomy that completely dismissed the idea of function or program, even though I hopefully show in the book that program inheres in a segment of his production. Right? He did not take anything of that into account because he was essentially a geometer, essentially a scientist, who, by the way, never used a computer in his life. And so everything is drawn by hand and all the calculations are just his own brain power, no computer. Right? All right. I spoke about sponge polyhedra. There's a certain kind of sponge surface. There's a certain kind of sponge surface called minimal surface, which played a particularly important role in his work. And I'll explain what that is in a second. But just to say that before him, there were people who looked into minimal surfaces in depth, such as, for example, Alan Schoen, an American researcher who produced any number of these, not only for NASA, actually, such as this gallery we have up on screen. This is from 1970, I think. So rather than minimal surfaces, it was rather what Bert called space network theory. So he produced like basically, I don't know, like hundreds of these over the years, everything by hand, again, no computer. So space networks. Something he looked a little bit less into that, but to me it's fascinating, called quasi-crystallinity. So meaning the production of patterns that are ordered, but not periodic, right? So patterns that somehow have a certain structure to them, so you can understand them and have a mathematical formula behind them, but never repeat themselves. The different sections of the pattern are not self-iterative, self-identical. And that was discovered in like 82 by a Nobel Prize in chemistry called Dan Shechtman, who happens to be friends with Michael Burt, by the way. So yeah. This is the sponge polyhedra that I mentioned earlier. So composite patterns of configurational continuity developing in 3D and into infinity. And these are the sponge surfaces instead, right? Which is just basically double curved surfaces, sometimes regular, sometimes less regular, sometimes minimal surfaces, sometimes hyperbolic, all depending on the type of surface. Okay, so only a certain portion of his work can be considered to be architectural because can realistically house a program in a way that's basically believable, right? So for example, the ones that I have up on the screen cannot be considered architectural because they're so complex, so entangled that the number of iterations and simplifications that require in order to be something like the kernel or the skeleton of a building would basically completely change the identity of the geometry, right? So a large portion of his production does not intersect architecture, really, right? could be maybe a pavilion, potentially piece of furniture, maybe very complex, but something like a building, hard to imagine, right? But then there are others who are architectural, right? Again, that's not his goal at all, right? He's just trying to deal with geometry, right? So this is from a publication he put out in 1974 titled Infinite Polyhedra, along with two other co-authors. And so what's interesting about this is that if this actually shows an expansion of the domain of sponge polyhedra, and some of them can be taken to be buildings in embryo, really, so like skeletons of actual architecture, then the book may be taken as a kind of scientific expansion of architectural configurations, right? Because all of those are proven to be different through a series of, like equations you'll see, right? There's a specific notation for every iteration of that. And since some of them are architectural, that means you could, in theory, almost scientifically prove the novelty of a certain architectural configuration, right? I think that's something. So the building that those could be made into is given by the configurational nature of the geometry. So for example, those are called cylindrical type, and they resemble tower envelopes, clearly, right? Now, the so-called monolayered resemble single-story buildings with courtyards in between, right? Clearly. These are some of the multi-layer and multi-directional ones. This is when it starts to get complicated, especially with the multi-directional ones, but the ones that are realistically capable of housing a program can be assimilable to something like a multi-story buildings with openings at different heights. Okay, so some of the multi-layered and multi-directional type, which is the last ones you showed, as well as so-called minimal and hyperbolical sponge surfaces. Okay, I'll say just a word about minimal surfaces, because if not, I'm going to continue to say the word and it's not clear what it means. Basically, a minimal surface is one where the mean curvature of the whole surface equals 0. What that means is that all of the convex portions and the concave portions cancel each other out. And the implications of that is that load transmissions across the surface run exclusively through tensile and compressive stresses, right? So there's no torsion, there's no flexion in the surface. Now, if you have no flexion, no torsion in the surface, then you can reduce the amount of material you need for it to stand to a bare minimum, right? And so that's why scientists would call those surfaces like those where materials achieve a moment of truth or something, because you can really have the best material to resistance ratio, the most optimal, right? That's why I call it minimum. They're really minimum. So now it's geometry that does all that, right? Now the hyperbolical kind, that's something that's a little more complex, but minimal surfaces, basically that's what they do. So a property of these minimal surfaces and hyperbolical and some of the multidirectional and multi-layer is that they divide space into two reciprocal subspaces that are interwoven in 3D, but never intersect, as a matter of fact. It's sort of like a yin-yang. You think of yin-yang, where two portions define one another without actually penetrating one another. So what's black is black, what's white is white. And the limit in between, which in this case is basically the surface, the membrane in between, acts as a separation between the two reciprocal subspaces. Only if the membrane is perforated can a connection be created between one subspace and the other subspace. So this particular condition gives rise to something I suggest calling spatial reciprocity, which I understand could potentially be a productive concept, right, to use in architecture, because architecture often operates on the basis of heuristic binaries, right, such as private versus public or open versus compartmentalized. And so it seems like spatial reciprocity could potentially tap into that in productive ways. So to clarify this a little further, what I have on the screen is, this is the double house by MVRDB in Utrecht. And this is the SUS housing project by Toyota in, I think it's in Fukushima. So this is a case of spatial reciprocity in section alone, right? So you see this is one house and this is another house. And so they define one another in a way that you see this interwoven nature of the two, but actually they remain independent. So in the case of Ito's project, that happens in plan. It happens in a little bit more of a soft way than for this case, but you can also see in plan how there's this kind of mutual definition, right? So what happens with spatial reciprocity in 3D is that you have this and that simultaneously, right? So when you cut in plan or this section, you have this reciprocity, right? So that's how it is different, I guess, from the few examples we find sometimes in architecture. Now, that I'm just going to explain the idea of this topological equivalence. So basically, this is the same, this guy is the same as this guy, right? Even though this is curved and that's flat surfaces. So this is what we would consider to be a primitive. And any number of these guys, you could have like many, right? Any number of these guys that are reducible to a primitive through topological transformations would be topologically equivalent, would share the same form. This is what I started talking about earlier with Giorgini, right? So this idea of topological equivalence is, I think, important to keep in mind, because the opposite of that is that each primitive that's irreducible to anything else, that you cannot carry into anything else, because basically, embodies the kind of minimum manifestation of a given organization, embodies a unique configurational kernel, right? So, and for that reason, it's topologically unique. It's topologically unique would be the opposite of topologically equivalent, right? And that would allow you to really distinguish how one of these or an architectural equivalent to one of these would be fundamentally different. It's a matter of kind of a little bit starting the house from the roof as opposed to the foundations, because I'm, here talking about primitives directly with these very complex or relatively complex geometries. Basically, the pieces of geometries that are given to start thinking about topology are the line, the plane, the cylinder, the cube sphere, the mebistrip, the Klein bottle, and hyperbolical surfaces, right? So those are considered to be like the main geometric primitives, right? So this is already more complex than that. And the topological invariance, the things that you cannot change if you want to maintain this topological equivalence, would be something like genus, orientability, number of edges, sides and connections, and flatness, not flatness, which I'm going to just throw it out there. Some of those may more or less be intuitive enough to see what they mean, others maybe a little bit less. If I have a chance, I can mention something more about one of those later on. Okay, so I think one of the interesting conclusions of this is that because every one of these, well, in this case, the space networks, but I showed earlier the space polyhedra with their own notation, have their own notation describing basically a combination of the elementary periodic unit, the basic thing that repeats itself in space, and the aggregational logic. And that notation is different from every one of those iterations. Then that configurational irreducibility can be actually shown through notation, right? It's not something, it's not a matter of opinion, right? There's actually a distinct notation for every one of those that cannot be reduced any further, right? So maybe something interesting to keep in mind is this idea of configurational irreducibility, something that can reduce any further to any other primitive. Something I try to do at some length in the book in general is to see how these tunnel networks can be interpreted as the basis of programmatic relationships, right? So for example, this is a different approach, right? But you end up basically on the safe side of things. So let's say this is program activity A, lobby hall, bathroom, and so on. And these lines would represent the connection between those activities. That means that if you forget about the polyhedra earlier and the surface earlier, and you start with that, you can actually generate a form out of a prompt. Right? Remember that the idea with the book is actually to deconstruct form, right? Is to undo it, to see if we can kind of turn it around and see it also from the other side. So part of the thing that I try to do to the best of my ability in the book is to see how these networks can be interpreted as barriers of programmatic relationships as well. And to that end, I offer a series of terms such as expansion areas, transition regions, or programmatic condensers, programmatic unfolding, sub-zoning, fluctuating programmatic thresholds. So basically a vocabulary to reimagine how we think about space, housing a number of activities, right? So instead of having, for example, a hard line as a partition that does nothing but divide, maybe you can subdivide space with further spaces, and there's no partition, right? And that further space happens to fluctuate in relation to the spaces that are on either side of that other space, right? So all of a sudden you have something that kind of organizes itself without the need for a hard partition, right? So that's maybe a quick idea as to how some of these kind of notions can be rethought. Well, Burt was extremely ambitious geometrically, as you can see, and he did all of that very, very early. He was a pioneer in that regard. But the architectural applications of those pieces of geometry, which he kind of had in mind somehow, ended up being actually very modest, right? As you can see up on screen. So, small pavilions, collapsible tents, little sculpture, another pavilion is from 1980, a little bit larger, but still primarily a roof, basically. But there's one exception, and this project from '69 called Aquaville for the, I think it's the Paris Biennial of Artists, which is the only example in his entire career where he envisioned one of those surfaces turned into a fully fledged building, basically, right? Where you can see some floor slabs inside the meandering surfaces and walkways and staircases and all that. This is the only example. So when 45 years later, approximately, I showed him this to Burt, he was in awe completely because he didn't think it possible to actually do that, to use one of the surfaces as a basis for a building, right? That's the 2004 runner-up competition entry by Andrea Branzi, recently passed away actually, and Toyo Ito for a project in Ghent, runner-up, right? So they came second, and then built the same concept built by Ito as the Taichung Opera House, in my opinion, in a much less successful way. But basically, that's a case where a minimal surface served as the basis for the building. What you see up there is actually not a minimal surface because it's been deformed. Right? Maybe I'll say a little bit about that later, about the relationship between geometry and architecture. But so I showed that to Burns. He said, "Wow, that's amazing. I never thought that possible." Well, actually, he did. Right? He just didn't remember. Maybe because it was a one-off. So basically, he had forgotten. It's incredible because even the colors are similar. Right? It's like this bluish, pinkish tones there. And anyway, he had no idea. So I showed Ito also Burt's work, and he told me he had no idea about it. And as a matter of fact, I mean, this is going off on the tangent a little bit, but the idea for that project is actually not Ito's. He's a Hirata, so he's right hand at the time, who came up with a sort of coral reef-like model, and then showed it to Ito, and Ito said, "Wow, this is amazing. We have to find a way to rationalize it." And that's how, with engineers, they slowly but surely came to that. Anyway. All right, so lastly, onto Balmont. I said, well, he is still alive, and he's sort of like a polymath, basically. I mean, he's an intellectual in addition to a designer and an engineer. So part of what I do is to not only look at and analyze his formal ideology, but also to discuss the different intellectual stages of his career through a detailed analysis of his writings and manuscripts. And main argument here is that his formal ideology can be traced to the influence of Fray Otto in art. Right? So Cecil Banmo was a top person at Arup. Most of you will know what Arup is, of course, throughout the year 2000, the decade of the 2000s. And Fray Otto worked with Arup engineers in the 70s. And what I'm arguing in the chapter and try to show is that many of the anti-modernist elements of Fray Otto's design schemes and research somehow became were influential for Bachmann as well, and structured the beginning of his career in terms of his kind of design thinking. So question concerning nonlinearity, minimal surfaces, complex morphology, and something called biological structuralism, which I'm not saying anything at all in the talk either, even though it's a very important concept for the book as well. Started to become part of the lexicon of Arup in the 70s, right? And this also became important for Bachmann as well. As you can see here, these are two projects where Fray Otto was instrumental at Arup in the 70s. So on the left, drawings for the Kokomas government complex in Riyadh. And on the right, these are experiments in form thinking, and actually in particular with branching patterns. And you'll see how, when I show a little bit of Bachmann's work in a second, you see the parallels with that. So as I said, well, he's the polymath, he's published 4 books. Informal, the one on the left being the one that he's most known for. And what I suggest in the book is that the collaborative malleability that he's shown throughout his career, Bachmann has worked with Enrique Miralles, Shigeru Ban, Philip Johnson, Rojas, Ito, many of the who's who of architecture between the late 70s and the late 2000s, more or less. So his ability to adapt and work productively with so many architects who have different approaches to architecture has to do with the fact that he has developed a theoretical body of work whose instabilities, as a matter of fact, confer enough of a suppleness and a playability such that he can adjust to any number of different architects, right? So that's maybe not that common, right? Because when you write a theory of something or you have your writings on something to try to be consistent, then oftentimes the result is the reverse, right? I mean, you become entrenched in what you think, or there's a kind of coherence and water tightness to all of that, and then it's hard to adjust. So in my view, I try to show in the book how here it is the opposite, right? The instability of his theoretical work turns out to be extremely productive. So here you see these are faxes with Rojas. This is for a tower competition in La Défense from 91. This is also with Rojas. I have a good number of faxes in the book as well, and go through them. It's really fascinating to read all of that and see how they debate ideas. In fact, I mean, nobody uses faxes anymore, obviously, but at the time, that was the medium to exchange believably interesting ideas, in my opinion. Then there's also with Daniel Libeskind on the left, and with Shigeru Ban. This is the one with Shigeru Ban is for the Mets, for the Pompidou Mets in France, primarily for the roof. And that's with Philip Johnson for a tower project in 99. So there are two concepts of engineering that are important, in my opinion, in his whole trajectory. So one is what they called episodic structure, which is developed primarily with Rojas, which would be about thinking that usually a load-bearing structure in a building is a more or less homogeneous distribution of elements all across the building, right? So you have columns throughout the building, right? And you have walls throughout the building, more or less. An episodic structure would entail a series of different kinds of structure in different points of the building, right? In a sort of juxtaposition that somehow creates different structure scenes, if you like, right? So this makes sense working with Rojas, who's somebody interested in scripts, right? So what he wants for his buildings to do is to go from one scene to the next, onto the next, onto the next, and so on. So the idea of episodes of structure works very well with this ideology. As you can see, this is in Unsal in Rotterdam, where you have castellated beams turned 90 degrees, exposed X cables. You have tilted columns in concrete. In a different part of the building, you have semi-arched braces that are also visible across the ceiling, tree trunks, cladding, straight columns on a different floor, right? So as you walk through the building, you experience all these different episodes of structure. With Ito, the concept, however, was something they call structure trace. So the idea that structure will be the outcome of a process where a certain element is sort of evolved or put through a process where it evolves in time along a path described usually by an algorithm, right? And so in other words, the elements of the load-bearing structure would be the materialization of the trace of that movement in time, right? So the best example probably is the Serpentine Pavilion from 2002 that he did with Daniel Garcia, an engineer who was his right hand at the time, who actually did the script for this. It ended up working actually in this case. I mean, in the book, I analyzed a little bit of how, in this case, for example, it ends up working primarily in 2D as a matter of fact, right? Because this is a pavilion, this is not a building, right? So all of the structural trace development ends up constituting the envelope of the pavilion, right? But inside it's basically just a body, right? It's one single space. So there's no special intricacy on the inside. So in other words, it stays bidimensional in a sense. Something that emerges through the work is the idea that the dynamic character of these formal procedures, I mean, I just talked about the structural trace approach, generates accidents and anomalies along the process, right? The evolutionary nature of the process is such that anomalies and accidents appear. This is one case of a roof structure for a stadium that he did with two German architects in the 90s. There are a number of conceptual slippages in his work that I go about analyzing. So the instability that I talked about earlier, of course, applies theoretically as well. So random versus chance, athletism versus adjacency, sequence versus series, universals versus absolutes. Some of these terms are usually understood to be synonyms, right? Like, random and chance are more or less the same thing, sequence and series. But actually, there's a lot of nuance around these oppositions, and times where he says one thing about one term, another thing about another term, and this instability is part and parcel of the thinking and how it translates in design. Many examples where figural conditions or conditions of shape as opposed to form are spatialized, right? So borders and limits turned into regions of spatial speculation, right? As opposed to just, what they used to be like over here. So in a way, ways of transitioning from shape to form, like going from shape to form. Also, many ways in which there's a kind of concomitance or simultaneity of orders. So different kinds of orders overlapping within the same design, right? And so if that's the case, then it becomes about how do you characterize that relationship between those different kinds of orders? And so I suggest two, for example, interdependence through nesting. So you have a certain number of orders nested within one another. There's a way in which those orders become interdependent. And that's the case, for example, with the cladding of the Victoria and Albert Museum project with Libeskind, where there's an aperiodic tiling on the facade that's articulated around this idea of interdependence through nesting. And in other cases, we can talk about independence through superimposition, right? So basically, there's, for example, if you take this guy, there are actually three kinds of orders here, right? So there's the points, the dots, there's the spiral, and then there's the line. And so somehow they depend on one another, but at the same time, they become independent. They are not nested. Actually, like it was the case before with the tessellation pattern of the facade. So in this case, they are basically superimposed, even though there's a relationship of dependence between them. Now, any number of those patterns and lines that you see and sketches and all of that tend to possess a certain structural intelligence, right? Because he's an engineer. So they embody what I suggest calling twofold structural awareness, right? So structure in the sense of the traditional sense of the building's physical support, so the load-bearing structure, but also in the sense of the organizational properties of form, right? So when you think of the term structure, oftentimes it can mean like those two different things, right? Load-bearing structure and also something like organization. So in many of these sketches, both actually coexist within the same design. So just getting there and ending with Balmont here. I think what's happening here at the end of the day is that there's a kind of philosophy of order that starts to emerge, which takes its clues primarily from nonlinearity, which is something that I haven't really explained either. Maybe it'll come up in the discussion later, and something relatively counterintuitive. And through the logic of nonlinearity, there's a kind of new idea of how different kinds of order can coexist within the same design. Okay, and lastly, I suggest any number of these terms and theoretical propositions in analyzing the work of these three figures. And then at the end, what I try to do is basically collect them, assemble, somehow try to construct with it, hopefully a coherent, more or less coherent framework, and then elaborate further on it to try to suggest something like a concept of form with a number of aspects associated with it. So I'm going to just say a few things here that appear in that last chapter. For example, the idea of a gradient of programmatic resolution. So the three main categories between form and ability, right? So form, zero resolution, no program. Form acquires programmatic immanence, program starts to inhere in form, then you arrive at architectural form. Then the architectural form is completed and refined with everything you need for that to be a building, partitions, exact proportion, all of that. And that takes you from architectural form to something like a building. The possibility that programming hearing in form can be embedded in a numeric basis. So in the case of Giorgini, as I said, these topological transformations, which are driven by numbers, really, right? So the way in which these bending forces, triangular symmetry, and rotations applied to any number of these geometric configurations are driven by numbers in such a way that then they can realistically house a series of human activities is another way of saying that really programming hearing in form in any number of these is actually embedded in a numeric basis. The same is true for birds, sponge, polyhedra, at least those that can be considered to be architectural, because it's basically numbers that regulate the porosity, permeability, symmetry, and the qualities that confer those geometries, pieces of geometry, with the capacity to house an architectural program. And the same is true for Balmont's work or Balmont's collaborations with these architects. For example, this is the S project also with Ito, where it's numbers that regulate the column pattern and how they grow in height in such a way that the outcome is capable of housing the program of the department store, right? So yeah, I'll leave it at that. This may seem kind of obvious, but it's actually not that obvious. Because the conditions of buildability and inhabitability, I would argue, apply to architecture, but not to geometry, because geometry is not something that needs to be inhabited or built. You cannot simply transition from topology to architecture, right? That would be a mistake. So there's an architectural interpretation of what I've been calling these topological invariants and a number of these topological aspects that's necessary from, when trying to transition from topology to architecture. So some of what I try to do in the book, and there's also somebody, maybe some of you may know him, called Juan Antonio Cortés, who already did some of that back in between 2010 2012 in architectural interpretation of topology for that transition to be workable. So there's like a whole other project there, basically, that's interesting to go in. Okay, I'm not going to elaborate on this because I said already a few things, but I would require more. Topological equivalence reveals formal sameness and distinct yields formal singularity. I throw out there in the book and talk a little bit about the fact that the organizational nature of a piece of architecture is traceable to a construct but I suggest calling spatial infrastructure, but that would be, you know, back to the second book, actually I presented here a couple of years ago, and that's the one that elaborates on that. The quintessential spatial infrastructure of the 20th century being the Maison Domino, the Corbusier Maison Domino. And any spatial infrastructure embodying the previously unavailable architectural primitive will extend the domain of architectural forms. So in other words, this configurational irreducibility that I mentioned earlier can be taken as a marker for the extension of form in an architectural sense. There are three open territories for experimentation, in my opinion, when it comes to certain kinds of spatial infrastructures, really, or geometric constructs that are architectural in that they incorporate the idea of the potential of a program, and one is those featuring spatial reciprocity. I mean, that's a theme that has been incredibly under-researched, and I think I'm not attempted a lot in the history of architecture. Quasi-crystallinity, because basically that allows you to design a work of architecture whose different scales of program and different scales of spaces can coexist and be coordinated through a kind of underlying pattern, while at the same time there's no repetition, because quasi-crystals are, as I said earlier, ordered but not periodic. So that has a lot of potential for playing and investigating the impact of that for a program. And then fractals, of course, right? Because what we do in architecture oftentimes is basically to nest scale. So the scale of a bathroom has nothing to do with the scale of a lobby, and then nothing to do with the scale of whatever room. And you know, fractals do just that. Basically, they orchestrate these interscalar relationships. I suggest a few ways in which these three-dimensional networks can be used to generate programmatic regimes, as I said earlier. So to go from program to form. And I also talk about formation. Many of these processes to arrive at whether it's Giorgini's work or Bird's or Valmont have something in common with what Stan Allen theorized as field configurations and field conditions, which is a text that, if you know it, I really highly recommend that you read it. One of the salient aspects of that is the importance given to part-to-part relationships, or what he also called local syntax, or the way in which one element relates to the element right next to it. And this local determinism for these elements is really present in Giorgini through the beam shell. The story that I want to explain it. For the case of Birds, it would be the elementary periodic unit, so a unit that repeats itself to generate the whole aggregation. And then in Bauman's case, it would be the individuated action. So the fact that you have an initial action that gives rise to a processing time that ends up generating a certain construct at the end. So the kind of generative process. The interaction topology makes style irrelevant to determination of form, because style basically unfolds at the level of shape. As I said earlier, qualities concerning shape are rendered irrelevant by topology. There's the idea of singular versus neutral non-referentiality. Can you produce architecture that doesn't necessarily refer to a codified framework of aesthetic references, right? And rather produce something that's self-referential in two different ways. Again, I'm not explaining any of this, right? So I'm perfectly aware that this may sound cryptic, but if any of this is interesting, I can elaborate later. And that's all, right? So I guess one of the main goals of this is to offer a vocabulary, right, to think about architecture, and maybe some of that sparks, you know, the interest of some of you and any number of people who will read the book. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. So how do we go about this with the respondents?
Do you guys want to stand, or do you want to, so that you face the students or the audience?
Yeah, we can bring chairs if you like. An idea. We have a cocktail outside. It's going to be there for only 45 minutes. I wonder if we do the discussion over food and drinks there. Like we can just sit in a circle with food and do the discussion. What do you think?
In this room?
Sorry?
Outside? It's
Yeah, it's here. It's
In the lobby.
on this floor. Because otherwise we'll miss the cocktail. It's a pity. They're gonna wrap up. They wrap up at 7:45?
Yeah.
Okay. So,
And then the Zoom and the recording then is gonna be in the wrap.
yeah. We could set up, a laptop there. And or we can bring in
Just
food.
We can keep it
for
very
30
short.
Yeah, for 30 minutes and then.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. So this is.
But I need to be brief, right? So. I will be brief, I promise, because they know me. The first thing, thank you for the invitation, thank you for the presentation, and thank you for the book that I think is really relevant. We are in a kind of advantage because we read the book and you haven't read the book, and the book is really, really interesting. For me, it's really interesting for many different reasons, of course, because the three guys that have been presented, especially Vittorio Giorgini and Mikhail Bort, that I didn't know about them at all. And they are like a real discovery. Their work is amazing. Both the geometrical shapes that this guy, Mikhail Bort, came upon, is like, what? They are really beautiful in themselves, but they are also productive. And the work of Giorgini also is really nice. He has some pavilions, some of the pictures that you put, the tela gallinero, the chicken metal mess that was supposed later to be projected with concrete. But in the state of the existing state in the photos, they looks like a contemporary Japanese architecture. It looks something really modern. So thank you for the discovery of them. And thank you especially for the terminology, the precision in the terminology for the whole book and in your presentation. In that sense, you're like a philosopher trying to really build up with precision any concept, any word that has been used. You didn't have the time to present all those words here, but it is incredible in the book. It looks like a work of, I don't know, I know that you like Spinoza, the philosopher, so it looks like a really like a logical elaboration, or Immanuel Kant. If you read the books, the critic of judgment or the critic of pure reason of Immanuel Kant, the guy starts with something, and after 500 words later, there is still this something at the beginning somehow embedded in the whole argument, and I can read this trace in the book. So this for me is really interesting. Presenting this architects, designer, hybrids is really interesting. It's really interesting the terminology, the different, especially the play of oppositions with words, with which you try to conceptualize some of the aspects. There are many dual production of concepts. The stylistic non-referentiality is one of them, or the twofold structure awareness. All those type of conjunction of words, they really try to define the architectural production in a very precise way, and they are really well defined. What else? Because I should be short. I really like the title, the idea of dispositional intelligence, that there is an intelligence, there is thinking, there is actual thinking in how we organize spaces. Or I'm not that precise, so form and shape, they are not equivalent. You have really realized that they are not equivalent, but sometimes for us and in the discussion in the studio, for example, we tend to confuse the ideas of form and shape in a different ways. But the idea that the physical and material configuration of a space is create a specific type of architectural configuration and architectural knowledge, for me, is really interesting. That, of course, is not something new, but it's really well elaborated across the book. And because I really like to play with words, and some of you know that too, tracing a little bit of the different meanings of disposition, they're really interesting for me, because disposition can be this distribution of things in a space, how you dispose things. It's also connected with the idea of disposal, which for me is really relevant, what you take and what you need to put aside, and also with kind of authorities, for example, they create dispositions for something, and you public in the Boletín Oficial del Estado in Spain, for example. There is also kind of what's the word for that? Something that enforces something else to happen, in the idea of disposition, that they are entangled in this dispositional intelligence. And very two quick things. There are many, but I don't want to go along the whole thing. You said many times that you want to take constructions out the relations between form and shape, or the intelligence that is behind architectural design and form, etc. Well, one of the very good definitions is about what is architecture, or architectural configuration of a geometrical form. This idea of the conditions of possibility, of buildability and inhabitability, and one more restricted than the other, that also goes to the logic embedded in Immanuel Kant's work, for example, this idea of regimes or conditions of possibility of something. I find really interesting. There are three that I will not only mention, because for me they have this poetical / deconstructive possibilities for the three different characters. Giorgini plays a lot with the idea of metaphor, the metaphor of nature. Has not been that present in the presentation, but definitely is in the book, this idea, which is a very deconstructive idea. We have seen in the case of Michael Barty's surfaces that they have, I don't remember exact word, but that they create like their double that they never meet, like the house of the MBR house, etc. And this for me is super poetical, that the idea that there is something like the double geometrical of a shape, that they never get in touch, but they are strictly or interconnected for the rest of their life, for the whole production. This is something for me really beautiful in the sense of a poetical set, but also very deconstructional. And when you mention trace in the case of the Serpentine Pavilion designed by Balmont and Toyo Ito, the idea of trace, the idea of huella in Spanish, that something has, because they were using trace more like a line. A trace is also this idea of something present in something that is absent at the moment, but that is still present. No, when there is a trace of something, you can say, oh, there are some tracks, there is traces of steps in the sand. Someone has been there, but the someone is not there anymore, yet still is somehow there present in the trace. These three deconstructive ideas or concepts goes for the idea of, because for me, one of the interesting things in the book is that there is a way trying to think a logic of non-identity. They go for that. In a metaphor, when you say something is something else, you're saying, oh, your eyes are the sea. You are not really saying that your eyes are the sea. You try to say that you are as beautiful as the sea, that they are some characters of the sea that are embedded in your eyes. So then this idea that comes from early Greek philosophy, that when something is something else, they are the same thing, gets destroyed. It happens across different places in the book, and I find it really interesting. And I stop now, I'm sorry for the long period.
Okay, so I just wrote a few notes after reading the book that I would like to share with you. And well, of course, thank you for the presentation. I'm very pleased to be here today to talk about and to know a bit more about Aragüez's latest investigation, this new publication that I'm happy to see that in my opinion, builds up over his previous one. About 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago, we were here discussing that previous book that was like a compendium of writings under the name of spatial infrastructure. And we had the opportunity to discuss at that time that those writings were in a way looking for new ground, or at least a new framework, a valid framework for architectural theory and knowledge. And at that point, I thought that was very hopeful and very helpful at the same time. That book, Spatial Infrastructure, tries to delineate some boundaries around the field of architecture, trying to capture its meaning and place it in a more central place in the cultural discourse. So some of the propositions in that book, in order to accomplish this suggestion, were, and I just went through my notes for the other time, just to search for alternatives for the duality of the building as a representation or as a spatial organization, to turn to nature as and its organic procedural strategies, and to engage to external fields of knowledge, not as something happening just on the side, but as something we could incorporate to our own discourse. So I believe this new book embodies precisely that. True to his own propositions, Aragüez focuses this time on the research in science and engineering, this parallel world closely related to architecture, but somehow, for some reason, that we most of the time just put aside. And I think that this is a brave thing to do, just this willingness to cross into that space, just like inviting that unconventional, slightly unpredictable relative to a gathering that you don't know if it will fit with your friends. But yes, of course, we should include other perspectives, especially science and engineering, as they are for part of our design team, most of the science. So in a way, I imagine with this new book, as if Aragüez has opened a new door into one of the rooms inside the big building, which is architectural theory. And inside this room, we see 3 different characters, 3 researchers working and investigating in 3 different areas of science. As mentioned before, we see Giorgini untangling the laws of topology, Bert obsessively working in different versions of morphology studies, and Balmont trying to grasp uncertainty and surprise through chaos theory. They're just like some sort of alchemist trying to decipher nature and matter. Diagrams of forces, geometric logic, and patterns in search of the understanding of space and the qualities of form. The documents included in the book are really impressive. You need to see them. They are very complex, beautiful, obsessive drawings, lines of forces, diagrams of traces, rendering visible the very nature of physics, geometry, weight, growth, stability, some cues, some codes, connections, mapping out the structure of the networks our lives are laid on. And then I cannot help just going through all this immense amount of work, but feel a bit hopeless this time, as if this were an impossible quest to set the grammar for all, as if we could try to condense in just one object or construction, any object, the whole of the laws of the universe. It occurs to me that we would anyway be just, we kept just a small sample of much wider complexity, a tiny line in an immense book. And I don't know, maybe it's just the time or the events these past days that make me feel this way, but I seem to have in my head more questions than answers. Just feeling our work as architects could only decodify a very, very small part of it all. Just feeling a tiny particle in a big ocean, like the 2 scuba divers in the cover of the book. But then, there in the cover of the book, and just as José Vela has just said, I found then the answer. And those two great words, the keywords, dispositional intelligence, the very definition of what architectural design should be, a way to navigate the world through our architectural theory.
Thank you. Thank you, José, for inviting us today, and thank you for the book. I really think this book is, as has been already said, something relevant, something that extremely ambitious, extremely brave. You already point to the gap that has been around architectural theory since the first 2000s. I don't know. In your previous book, also, criticality was one of the essays. Was pointing to that exhaustive or extreme theory that we had in the late 90s and first 20s. And since that, all of this has seemed to be forgotten. And for that, I think this kind of books is also important and necessary. I feel that the book is clear in the very complex world that it's navigating. It's clear, and the extremely erudite reference that you are all the time bringing up from philosophy to explain concepts that we have to understand to say how you are utilizing these three characters. It's important, and I think it's done in a very sophisticated and extremely precise manner. It has been said that the terms form, type, topology, program are not innocent, are completely studied to be program and not to be function, and for a lot of reasons that have not been. But it's I think what is most relevant. I didn't know Bort or Giorgini either. It has been a really interesting discovery. And what I think it's incredible. It's what you do with them. Because it's incredible what they did without computer. But I'm not able to talk about that. And it's not in my field of interest, as you could know. But what you are doing here with them, which is also in development of knowledge that you are doing from your first book building. It seems that you are going in the other way. You began with the building and you are ending with the form. We have in the middle this spatial infrastructure, which would be the embryo, the building in embryo, or the architectural form. So you build always up to down, but I think it's necessary to do that in order to find theories, which is the most important thing that I think you're doing with this book. Instead that, I had one question. I think it's incredible how you connect everything from, I don't know, from Duran, from the type and what we see, until Quinter and the type and what. Everything is built in a so precise way that when you feel that you have something to say, next chapter makes you rethink that what you were thinking is already it's already overcome. It's already thought by you, and you are driving us where you want to drive us. I don't know if you have been when you have it's like a script in a film in Hitchcock where you have all the pieces and you have to order them, and it seems that they are ordered in a way that whenever we have a doubt or what you are saying, you next chapter make us confident of what you have said. And the critique that you were going to, the question that you were going to do was solved. So I think in that manner, you build a whole argument about architectural form, and that architectural form should be thinking in another way. But at the very end, I have this question or this doubt, and it was what was more important to me to ask is when you arrive to the final the conclusion, and it's very difficult to conclude this kind of dissertations. There are two questions that I don't know if they are necessary. It's the question of singularity, because I think most of the discoveries that we can do around these three figures would be much broader than that specific to the very singularity of form. What I mean is, it seems that if the objective is to arrive to that singularity, we go out of all the history of architecture until Domino, Yokohama, and Taichung, or this O'Brien Gant. There are only three different architectural forms that are really relevant or really distinct in topological terms, because Renaissance or neoclassical palace would be the same as Zaha Hadid building, as you said, it's true. And that led us in a frustrating position. What I mean is that the book is extremely extremely potential. It makes us think that something new is possible, but at the same time, it's frustrated because making something new is really impossible. And the other thing is that this non-referential thing, at the very end, you say that we have to keep history, context, everything aside if we want to talk about form topologically. But at the very end, style appears again in this aesthetic interest that I think that you have or we should have as architects. And that is why you introduced this again. I think it's neutral versus singular referentiality. And that is where sponge surfaces become better or greater or more relevant than sponge polyedra, because polyedra looks like something familiar. And I don't know if that is appealing. For me, the very interesting thing that I have arrived or I have discovered in your book is, for example, this polyedra, the simple, the primitive one, which I think could be inhabited and built. Not because if not, we arrive again to Taichung, to something very marginal, because it's so singular that it's not to do architecture, but to do the very piece of architecture.
Very good questions. I'm going to try to address Ignacio, but also Clara and also Jose mentioned things that I have not really discussed in the talk, and make me think how the talk can be improved quite a bit, as a matter of fact. So I take that to be part of the very helpful responses. Ignacio is saying first that basically that there's a point in the book where I say, well, maybe in the whole of history of architecture, we've only come up with very few forms and many different shapes, but very few forms. So Ignacio is saying, well, if you put it that way, it meant it's actually kind of impossible to come up with a new form, because there's basically just three, right? Or four, very few. So I do say that in the book. There are two things to that. One is that in part that's to challenge designers who read the book to say, all right, so give it a go, right? If it's so difficult, you know, the more challenging, the more the more motivating, and see what you can do with it. And then secondly, a little bit more precisely, there's a whole 2 or 3 pages where I discuss and add on to what Juan Antonio Cortés already wrote about the architectural interpretation of topology. And there, if you actually go into more nuance, then there are ways to further subdivide that, or let's say, further add details to different types, right? So that there are not only 2 or 3 types that are clearly different because the kernel, the DNA of the whole configuration is clearly different and it's configurational irreducible. If you go into more detail on the lines of what Juan Antonio Cortés already did, such as, for example, well, strictly speaking, in topological terms, for a building to have 2 patios, 2 courtyards, that's different than a building having just 1 courtyard, actually, because this genus topological invariant that I mentioned in passing, the figure that is associated to that variable depends on the number of so-called handles, right? So basically how many holes the geometry has. So that's one way in which you can start to see, okay, wait a minute, all right, so that's gives me a little bit more variety to play with. Maybe a building with 4 patios, 5 patios is not the same, right? Also, if the patios, the courtyards are on different heights, that's also different, right, strictly speaking. Or if you think about, 99.9% of the buildings we design are based on so-called orientable surfaces, meaning the normal vector of the surface, for example, this floor stuff here, is not consistent across the surface, right? So on this floor, the normal vector always points in the same direction, meaning upward. But if you are on the floor below, the normal vector of this same surface, right, if it was just literally surface, points in the opposite direction. It's not consistent with this one. There is a certain type of surface where the actual normal vector is consistent throughout the whole surface. It doesn't change, doesn't flip. So there are a few examples also in architecture where you can do work with so-called non-orientable surfaces. So basically, these are just, like many other things in the book, in my opinion, are just really pointed out by way of suggestions for maybe if somebody's interested to, pick that up and develop another book out of it. Because it's true, it's just suggested, it's not really, developed. But there are ways to think about that. I mean, you could do an entire 5-year research to really create a theory as to how to create different irreducibly, configurations that are irreducible in an architectural sense by going into detail with what these kinds of details mean, and by creating a hierarchy out of it maybe as well. So one thing is to talk about the actual kernel, the configuration of the kernel, meaning the polyhedra. Another thing is to talk about edges, connections, courtyards, and so on, right? So, I could envision how that could be, it's not that in the book, right? But, so that's how I would kind of respond to that. Now, in terms of style, the thing is you come to a point where you realize, all right, so what do I do with this, right? Because it turns out that topology really does render shape irrelevant. And since style really primarily, maybe not 100%, but 99.9% unfolds a level of shape, then there's nothing to do with this, right? What do I do with that? And yet at the same time, as architects, we know that that's inescapable, right? That the whole question of aesthetics and style, whether you are more or less interested in it is basically inescapable. So what I realized is that if I pushed that line of thought, then it turns out that style is irrelevant in topological terms, and yet there are certain ways in which pushing that kind of reasoning through topology produces contributions at the level of aesthetics and style, right? So that sounds a little paradoxical, but I think it kind of makes sense if you read through it. So when I come to that point, then I realized, all right, so wait a minute. So if I look at Giorgini's work, there is a level of singularity which is shared with, for example, Taichung and some of Ito's work, which is not the same than if I look at the sponge polyhedra, even though, what I say in the book is actually this is also non-referential, because I cannot really quite tell what the time period for this is. Is it like modern, or is it like neoclassical, or it's just neutral, right? But it's also non-referential. It doesn't refer to immediately or readily to an aesthetically codified set of, like linguistic expressions in architecture, like postmodern, for example, Gothic, right? You identify it quickly. Sponge polyhedra, there's a neutrality to that can be rendered in any style. So what I think I do not do in the book, if I remember correctly, is I don't place necessarily a value judgment on either. I just say, if you achieve something like singular non-referentiality, then you will be also extending the domain of architectural expressions, right? By adding a new way of, materializing a building in terms of aesthetic code, right? If you go for something that's neutral, that's great if you appreciate not referring to a previous static code, but you may not be adding a new format of linguistic expression, I guess, right? So yeah, you may read a kind of value judgment into that, but honestly, as an because I'm also a practitioner, as you know as well. Depending on the case, it's true that you can, kind of appreciate one more than the other. So it's a matter of personal inclination. Of course, the budget, the number of other considerations, for sure. I would be very happy if someone would, picked up the book and say, oh, actually, I can think of maybe a new way of doing social housing, with this sponge polyp, as opposed to think of an opera house or something of that kind of scale and budget, right? That would be, and I think it's potentially doable because that's, they, seem realistic, so. Maybe any questions from the audience?
No, it's just maybe there.
Question is,
Yeah.
the cocktails.
Okay, so we can,
Let's
we can
continue
continue
the
more,
conversation outside.
more informally. Well,
Thank you very much
Thank
for
you,
that.
everybody, and thank you.
We don't know, negative.
Since we. Actually, was working in the studio, and discovered so many ideas.
Oh, for sure.
Like, what?
It doesn't matter.
I'm scared. This.
Of course, I remember,
inside,
yeah,
yeah.
I remember, like, this girl looks familiar. See, now I can place it, yeah.
This was like very.
That's why I told you guys. I said, yeah, you guys come to this. And I did
You referred to everything, and then you supported on the trees and the structures.